Tonight, we walk the quiet boards of Atlantic City. Moonlight glitters on damp planks, the ocean whispering secrets just beyond the rail. A man in a beige windbreaker moves with purpose. Slow, deliberate. Each step weighted not just by muscle, but by memory. Hands buried in his coat pockets, not for warmth, but for control. Nicodemo's Scarfo doesn't like surprises. His eyes sweep every shadow, every glass reflection from the casino fronts, every lingering nod from passers-by. The Tropicana's lights blink in a strange rhythm, like some coded warning only he understands. This is not a man who trusts easily, not a man who sleeps peacefully. And you? You wouldn't last 5 minutes in his shoes. Too much pressure, too many ghosts, too many lies that have to be remembered exactly. Before we get deeper, hit the like button and subscribe. Only if you actually enjoy this kind of storytelling. And let me know where you're watching from, your city, your local time. I read them all. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum. Let's step into tonight's story. Nicodemo's little Nicky, Scarfo, walked a tightrope between legacy and paranoia. Born March 8th, 1929, in Brooklyn, the son of a shoemaker, his family moved to South Philadelphia while he was still in grade school. The neighborhood pulsed with immigrant life. Boys playing stickball on cracked asphalt, women yelling across fire escapes, corner stores run by men who knew more about numbers than groceries. Scarfo didn't look like trouble. He was small, almost fragile. Teachers recalled him as moody, quick to take offense. One wrong glance, and his face would tighten like a fuse, waiting for the match. Other boys learned to shrug things off. Nicky learned to store them away, quietly, patiently, and wait. In those streets, respect was earned through charm, size, or force. He had no charm and no size, but he had a sharp tongue, quick fists, and a dangerous glint in his eyes that suggested he'd go further than anyone else dared. He started small, harmless pranks that turned mean, dares that turned bloody. The message was clear. Underestimate him at your own risk. By his late teens, he drifted into boxing. Not for titles, but for the right to hit without apology. He fought amateur matches in South Philly, collecting bruises and grudges alike. Strategy was his strength. He rarely won outright, but he always left a mark. That caught the attention of the wrong people, or the right ones, depending on your definition. Low-level associates of the Philadelphia crime family saw something in him, ambition, and the willingness to prove it with violence. One night in the early 1950s, a bar fight turned deadly. A shouting match, a flash of steel, and a man lay bleeding. Scarfo was arrested for manslaughter, but he didn't hide from it. He walked into court like a man wearing his rage as a badge. The jail time was short, but the effect was permanent. In that world, violence wasn't a liability, it was a resume. Many believe that without that stabbing, he might have been just another forgotten dockside scrapper. Instead, it was his audition for the life he was about to lead. By the mid-1950s, Scarfo had gravitated toward the Bruno crime family. Angelo Bruno, the gentle Don, preferred low-profile leadership, peace with profit. Scarfo didn't share that philosophy, but he was smart enough not to challenge power too soon. He stuck close, ran errands, made himself useful, especially when useful meant someone didn't get back up afterward. He began to live by a personal code. Never talk out of turn. Never let a slight go unanswered. Never trust a man who smiles too easily. Scarfo smiled, but only when it served a purpose, only when the math added up, only when it hurt. By the end of the decade, he was no longer the shoemaker's son. He was sharper, harder, a man with a memory like wet cement. Everything stuck. Philadelphia shaped him, but Atlantic City would decide his fate. He didn't rise through charm or clever talk. He rose by proximity to violence and by knowing exactly when to use it. His early jobs weren't glamorous, but they were enough to keep his shadow moving behind the right men, and to make sure every reflection in every window told him exactly what he needed to know. He wasn't shaking hands with bosses or sitting in smoke-filled rooms where fortunes were decided. Not yet. In those early Atlantic City days, Scarfo's life was all steel doors, cracked knuckles, and miles of road under a truck's tires. He drove deliveries through neighborhoods that didn't trust strangers, collected envelopes thick with cash for people who didn't like to be kept waiting, and ferried numbers, slips from one shadowed doorway to the next. To most, it was grunt work. To him, it was reconnaissance. Every address was committed to memory. Every door that opened, a fraction too slow, went into a mental ledger. The way people spoke, the grudges they carried, the debts they didn't think anyone noticed, he remembered it all. One bookmaker later joked that Scarfo could tell you who owed $1,054 without checking the books. It wasn't because he had to. It was because he wanted to. Information wasn't just useful. It was ammunition. And Scarfo kept his bullets dry. If you gave him an order, it was carried out exactly. If you crossed him, even in ways so small you might forget by morning, he never forgot. Those slights sat in the dark corners of his mind, sealed tight, waiting for the moment he decided the debt had matured. That moment came one night in 1963. A union delegate, someone Scarfo had no reason to dislike, laughed a little too long at one of his remarks. Maybe it was innocent, maybe it wasn't. The next morning, the man was found with his jaw shattered, and no memory of how it happened. No witnesses, no charges, but the story worked its way through the neighborhood until everyone knew, without anyone saying it, that Nicky Scarfo's patience had an expiration date. Not everyone admired the way he operated. Angelo Bruno, the gentle Don who valued peace above all else, saw Scarfo as a problem waiting for a place to happen. He's a dog with a chain, Bruno was rumored to have said, but the chain isn't bolted. In the late 60s, Bruno acted on that suspicion. He didn't promote Scarfo up the Philadelphia ranks. Instead, he shipped him out, Atlantic City. It wasn't the glittering casino haven the brochures promised today. Back then, the boardwalk creaked under tourists who had stopped coming in the numbers they used to. The air smelled of salt and rust. Casinos were still illegal. Hotels had faded paint and even older carpets. For a made man, or even someone orbiting that life, being sent there was a sentence, not an opportunity. To many, it was like being told to go count seagulls. To Scarfo, it was something else entirely, a punishment he could twist into power. He arrived with little more than a few loyal friends, a short fuse, and a grudge. He didn't storm into town. He slipped in like a shadow, making himself a fixture in the small bars where the owners knew every regular by name. The diners where old men read racing forms over burnt coffee, and the union halls where the real deals were whispered between bites of sandwiches. Scarfo didn't just watch people, he watched systems. Who handled the garbage contracts? Which paving companies got the sidewalk jobs? Which inspectors looked the other way? And for how much? Then, in 1976, fate rewrote the map. New Jersey legalized casino gambling. Almost overnight, Atlantic City transformed. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the sleepy shuffle of the old boardwalk. Construction sites sprouted where vacant lots had been. Union rosters swelled, and every delivery truck carried the scent of wet concrete and money. Scarfo didn't have to chase the wave. He was already on the shore, waiting for it to hit. He started small, slipping favors to local construction bosses. A contract smoothed here. A stubborn union rep convinced there. A handshake that came with quiet conditions. In a city rushing to reinvent itself, no one stopped to ask too many questions about the men standing just out of the spotlight. Soon, he wasn't just an errand man. He was the silent partner in a dozen small businesses. They all started doing better, almost as if fortune had decided to smile on them all at once. And behind those doors, Scarfo began building something of his own. His crew started small, handpicked not for size or brains, but for loyalty. He didn't need thinkers. He needed believers. Men who would step into a fight without hesitation, or fire a bullet without asking why. Some say Scarfo's true genius wasn't violence at all. It was understanding that in a city like Atlantic City, control came from contracts, unions, and favors, not from bodies in the street. If the mayor shook your hand, it didn't matter if he smelled gasoline on your jacket, because he still had to smile for the cameras. One of his first real statements came in the form of silence. A bartender at a small lounge had been slow paying for protection. Scarfo didn't bark threats or slam fists. He simply appeared at the far end of the bar 3 nights in a row, sipping ginger ale, smiling as if he was just another patron killing time. On the 4th night, the bartender handed him a thick envelope, trembling hands, no words, just a nod. Atlantic City was learning who really set the rules. Scarfo leaned into the role. Out went the work shirts and worn boots. In came pastel dress shirts with open collars, a gold chain when the mood struck. Not flashy, just enough to signal that he wasn't one of the working men anymore. No one noticed his height anymore. They noticed that construction foremen stumbled over his name, and precinct captains waved from across the street without making eye contact. But the paranoia stayed. Scarfo never sat with his back to the room. He never answered his own phone. He parked where he could leave, fast, always facing the exit. Associates said he'd switch tables in a diner if the light caught him wrong, claiming he didn't like seeing reflections in his coffee. Money flowed, but Scarfo counted something else with equal care. Enemies, debts, and the kinds of smiles that lasted a second too long. In his mind, power wasn't a crown, it was a countdown. And then there was the blade, not just the real one he carried, but the invisible one he kept pressed to the city's throat. By the late 70s, whispers of his reputation traveled faster than facts. One of those whispers started with a mistake. A low-level associate, a man Scarfo had let into his circle, got drunk at a social club. Liquor made him loud, and loud made him sloppy. He dropped names. He hinted at rackets. By morning, Scarfo knew. There was no meeting, no warning, no third party to handle it. Scarfo showed up himself. The man's body turned up behind a laundromat the next night, face down in a puddle of rainwater. No police statements, no charges, just silence, and a very clear understanding that loyalty to Scarfo wasn't a matter of words. It was a matter of survival. They say some men are dangerous because of the armies behind them. Nicodemo's Nicky Scarro was dangerous because he didn't need an army. He was the kind of man who'd walk alone into a room full of enemies and still make everyone feel like they'd been surrounded. The moment he personally handled a betrayal, no middleman, no warning, his reputation hardened like concrete in the sun. It wasn't just that he could order violence. Anyone could do that. It was that he would step in himself, handle the blade with his own hands, and walk away without a word. That made people's skin crawl, in a way no paid hitman ever could. Physically, he was nothing. Intimidating. Barely 5'5", narrow shoulders, the kind of guy you'd overlook in a crowd. But his size worked in his favor. He didn't stride into places like a conqueror. He drifted in like a shadow. You'd only realize he was there once you felt the temperature drop. His voice didn't boom. It was soft, nasal, almost bored. But if he was speaking to you, you could feel yourself being sized up, measured for worth, or for burial. One man who later flipped and joined witness protection described Scarro perfectly. He'd offer you sugar for your coffee while planning the exact time your body would hit the ground. No temper tantrums, no wild threats, just calculation. That made him unpredictable, and unpredictable men are the hardest to survive. By then, Nicky had shifted his focus. He wasn't chasing flashy rackets or street glory. He began buying property, not mansions or restaurants with his name on them, but dull, overlooked scraps of the city. A crumbling parking lot near a proposed casino site, a greasy diner down the block from a union hall, a boarded-up storefront across the street from a zoning office. On paper, they were worthless. In reality, they were chess pieces in a long game only he could see. When negotiation worked, fine. When it didn't, accidents happened. One developer laughed off Nicky's offer to help speed up permits. A week later, the man's car lit up in flames outside his home. The fire marshal called it bad wiring. Nicky didn't say a word, just gave a tiny shrug when asked. That was the Scarfo way. Never confirm, never deny, and let fear ferment in the silence. He understood something most street thugs didn't. Loud fear fades. Quiet fear seeps into the walls, the air, the morning coffee. You can't escape it because it's everywhere. Inside his tightest circle, Nicky elevated only a handful of men he trusted, and trust was rare currency with him. At the top of that list was his own nephew, Phil Leonetti. Blood, Nicky believed, ran thicker than ambition. In time, that belief would prove to be a dangerous blind spot, but in those days, it gave him an unshakable inner ring. His enforcers weren't chosen for brains or charisma. He picked them for their silence. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need explanations. They appeared where problems were, and problems disappeared soon after. Nicky called them the quiet ones. And Atlantic City in the late 70s had no shortage of problems. By then, the city had transformed from a fading beach town into a neon gold rush. Casinos rose from the ground, unions swelled with members, politicians hustled for a piece of the pie. And in the middle of it all, Scarro's shadow stretched wider and darker. Casinos nodded in his direction whether they wanted to or not. Unions operated on his schedule. Local politicians spoke in vague terms. Consultants, third-party arrangements. When deals brushed too close to his world still, Nicky was a man of ritual. He walked the same stretch of boardwalk most mornings, sat in the same booth at the same diner, eating the same veal cutlet, washing it down with the same dry red wine. The waitress who served him swore he never once touched the knife on the table. He brought his own. One night, at a backroom poker game, a fresh face from Newark made the rookie mistake of laughing a little too hard at a joke about Nicky's height. The room went still. Nicky didn't raise his voice or even frown. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded newspaper clipping, and slid it across the table. The headline? Local man found with both legs broken. The Newark kid read it, swallowed hard, and left town before sunrise. Nicky's style wasn't to threaten, it was to make you imagine the consequences. Imagination was always crueler than reality. For all his theatrics, Nicky followed rules, his rules. No random violence. Every act served a purpose. Every punishment carried a precedent. In his own mind, that made him not a thug, but a man of principle. A historian later called him an ethical executioner, though most would say the ethics were his alone to define. By 1980, his position looked untouchable. The city's money flowed like champagne, enemies kept disappearing, and every whisper of his name carried weight. But Nicky wasn't just a product of Atlantic City's boom. He was also a student of another era, another kind of boss. His earliest mentor was Angelo Bruno, the so-called gentle don of the Philadelphia crime family. Bruno's philosophy was the opposite of Nicky's instincts. He believed in peace, discretion, and keeping the mob out of headlines. He hated drug dealing, despised internal bloodshed, and punished recklessness. To Bruno, the best power was the kind no one noticed. Nicky respected Bruno's position, but not his softness. Where Bruno saw opportunity in harmony, Nicky saw opportunity in fear. Yet, he was smart enough to study his boss closely. In those days, Nicky stayed on the edges, watching meetings, memorizing debts, noting alliances and grudges. He spoke rarely, but his mind was always working, always plotting. Through the 60s and into the early 70s, he stayed useful in the background, collecting payments, smoothing over union disputes, and occasionally removing a problem permanently. His reputation became that of a man you called when you were out of options. As one of Bruno's underbosses put it, he's the emergency exit nobody wants to use. You don't go to Nicky unless you're ready to burn the building down. Bruno tolerated him for one reason. Nicky got results. And in a world where results meant survival, that was enough to keep even a volatile little man in the game. But as history would prove, Two men with such different philosophies could never coexist forever. And Nicky? Nicky was already dreaming of a city and a future where fear, not peace, was the currency that mattered. Some men rise to power by charm, others by cunning. Nicodemus Scarro's ascent was built on something far simpler and far more dangerous: results. That alone might have kept him in Angelo Bruno's good graces. But there was another reason the gentle dawn allowed this volatile, coiled spring of a man to keep prowling Atlantic City. Distance. Bruno understood that certain dogs need a yard to snarl in. Keep them behind a fence. Let the neighbors know they're there, but never let them inside where they can chew up the furniture. For years that worked. Scarro had space to operate, collect his envelopes, and flex his particular brand of intimidation without disturbing the quiet empire Bruno ran from Philadelphia. But patience was never Scarro's virtue. Being a tool in someone else's hand wasn't enough. He wanted the hand itself. And then, in 1980, everything changed. Bruno, who had avoided the spotlight for decades, was assassinated in the most sudden, unceremonious way possible. A single blast to the back of the head while he sat in his car. No warnings, no whispered threats, no tense sit-downs. Just the sharp crack of a shotgun and the kind of silence that lingers in a city's bones. The killing shattered the fragile peace Bruno had cultivated. The Philadelphia family, long kept in check by diplomacy and caution, fractured overnight. Old grudges surfaced, factions formed, and blood began soaking the sidewalks faster than anyone could mop it up. Scarro didn't grieve. He didn't even pretend to. To him, Bruno's murder wasn't a tragedy. It was a breach in the walls, a moment where the castle gates swung wide, and he was ready to walk through. He didn't rush in waving a flag. That wasn't his style. Instead, he began quietly summoning his network. He reached out to old allies, tested their loyalties, and gently reminded certain people of debts long overdue. He understood that in a storm, the smart man doesn't fight the wind. He waits for the other ships to capsize. The timing, however, came with a complication. Bruno's death set off alarms in law enforcement. The FBI, which had treated South Jersey like a side street in the mob's map, suddenly turned its full attention to the region. Agents doubled up on surveillance. Wiretaps bloomed like weeds. Men with cameras began showing up in cars that stayed parked a little too long outside meetings. Scarro adapted. He stopped holding court in predictable spots. Meetings happened in fishing boats rocking on the bay, in diners so loud you couldn't hear your own thoughts, or on park benches where passers-by became the perfect camouflage. His schedule became a mystery, even to his own crew. He moved like a man convinced the floor beneath him could vanish at any second, a chess piece sliding across a board where every square might be mined. And maybe that paranoia wasn't just tactical. Maybe it was the core of him. Some would, later, say he wasn't simply careful, he was terrified. Whether that fear sharpened him or ate at him depended on who you asked. In Atlantic City, he began to formalize his operation. Trusted lieutenants with clean public records were placed at the top, far from the dirtiest work. Layers of intermediaries insulated him from the mess. If the law came knocking, there'd be 3 doors to pass through before they even smelled his cologne. He had a way of reminding people not to get too comfortable. One new associate recalled being handed a steak knife during a celebratory dinner. When the man looked confused, Scarro leaned in and murmured, "For when your smile fades before dessert." Was it a joke? No one at the table wanted to test it. The laughter that followed was the kind you hear in a room that's just been struck by lightning, nervous, brittle, and relieved it wasn't aimed at you. More and more, his focus shifted toward the labor unions, especially in construction and hospitality. He maneuvered his people into leadership roles, made himself a silent partner in their decisions, and tightened his grip so subtly that casinos and contractors couldn't make a move without his nod. It was no longer about breaking kneecaps. It was about controlling the paper, permits, inspections, zoning approvals. He wasn't climbing the ladder anymore. He was replacing the rungs so only he could decide who reached the top. It worked. Slowly, inevitably, he became the unquestioned head of the Philadelphia family. The Bruno era, polished, diplomatic, restrained, was dead. The reign of little Nicky had begun. Shorter, meaner, and utterly unwilling to forgive even the smallest slight, Scarro ruled with a glare and a gun. To the tourists flooding Atlantic City in the early 80s, the place was a dream. Bright lights, endless gambling, and the intoxicating hum of money-changing hands. Cadillacs lined the curbs, women in sequins laughed into the night air, and fortunes were lost and won over green felt tables. But beneath that glitter, another game played out. Strikes didn't happen without his consent. Permits traveled in pairs, one stamped by the city, the other whispered into existence by Scarro's men. And his name? It was only spoken after the room had been checked for wires. His rise wasn't crowned with champagne toasts or gold rings passed around the table. It was sealed in calculation. He assembled his inner circle: Phil Leonetti, Lawrence Yogi Merlino, Frank Monti, and a handful of others, and announced in his own quiet, matter-of-fact way that the rules had changed. Fear would no longer be an unspoken understanding. It would be policy. And then came the blood. Within his first year as boss, more than a dozen men were removed, some for disrespect, some for hesitation, others for reasons known only to Scarro. Bodies were left in parking lots, slumped in alleyways, folded into the trunks of cars. Subtlety was not the point. The message was loud enough for the whole city to hear. There was a new order now, and it answered to one man. By the early 80s, Nicodemo's Scarfo had built an empire that ran on fear like a car runs on gasoline, and he made sure the tank was always full. Hesitation? That was a crime in his book, and he had no problem writing the death sentence himself. Take Vincent Falcone. Once, they'd been thick as thieves, sharing money, schemes, and champagne toasts. But somewhere along the line, Falcone's tongue started working overtime. He complained about money, muttered about how Scarro ran things, even hinted that maybe someone else ought to be in charge. That kind of talk doesn't just get you in trouble in Scarfo's world. It gets you erased. So one evening, Scarro invites Falcone over to a house on North Georgia Avenue. The excuse: let's smooth things over. A friendly drink, a little reconciliation. Phil Leonetti, Scarro's nephew and trusted underboss, is there too. Bottles pop, glasses clink, smiles all around. And then, mid-toast, Scarro calmly raises a pistol and puts a bullet in Falcone's skull. No shouting, no dramatic speeches, just cold precision. Leonetti would later say Scarro seemed more annoyed about the blood soaking into the carpet than about Falcone's betrayal. That was the man's nature. Even murder had to be on his terms. This wasn't the slow, polite game played by mob bosses in New York, or the chess match strategy favored in Chicago. Scarro ruled with whiplash unpredictability. One minute, he'd be laughing at your joke. The next, he'd be talking about cleaning house. And you couldn't be sure if you were on the cleaning crew or the mess. That unpredictability was his deadliest weapon. Violence wasn't just punishment, it was punctuation. Every act sent a message: don't get comfortable. Nepotism was another one of his habits. He made his nephew, Phil Leonetti, underboss, a move that didn't exactly win him popularity points. Plenty of old-timers in the organization grumbled about it, but Scarro didn't care. Blood, he thought, was easier to control than ambition. The bitter irony? Years later, Leonetti would be the one to flip, trading family loyalty for self-preservation. But for now, uncle and nephew were inseparable, ruling Atlantic City like it was their private casino floor. And what a floor it was. Scarro had his fingers in everything: the unions, the casinos, the construction racket. Contractors couldn't lay a single brick without his say-so. Hotel staff unions, under his thumb. High-stakes poker rooms. He provided the kind of security that came with a price tag and a threat. The FBI estimated that the Philadelphia family, under his command, was pulling in tens of millions each year from Atlantic City alone, the richest criminal turf on the East Coast at the time. But with that kind of money came a kind of paranoia most people couldn't imagine. Scarro suspected everyone of plotting against him. Even the men he paid, even the men who'd taken bullets for him. He wired his own offices for sound, not to catch outsiders, but to listen to his own crew. Meeting spots changed constantly. Cars were swapped at random. He never drank from a bottle unless it came sealed, and he'd once sent back a glass of wine just because the cork looked tired. The waiter thought it was about taste. It wasn't. It was about trust, and Scarrow didn't have any. The FBI, meanwhile, was tightening its net. Wiretaps caught his voice. Informants traded secrets for lighter sentences. Surveillance teams began mapping his every move, stringing his name to casinos, politicians, banks, and bodies with red yarn on their office walls. Most men might have pulled back, kept a low profile. Scarrow didn't. He pushed harder, building a pyramid of power so sharp at the top. Only one man could stand there, him. His leadership style was pure compartmentalization. No one knew the whole picture, not even Leonetti. Each man got a piece of the puzzle. Just enough to do his job, never enough to challenge the boss. If you tried to connect the dots, you'd find half of them missing. Scarrow made sure of it. That control extended to life and death decisions. Frank Monte, one of his most trusted captains, had served him loyally for years, collecting debts, smoothing over disputes, keeping the business wheels greased. Then came whispers. Monte was asking too many questions, maybe talking to the wrong people. Scarrow didn't call a meeting. He didn't give a warning. He didn't even bother to verify the rumors. He just gave the order. Monte was shot multiple times in broad daylight, right outside his home. No ceremony, no second chances. The message landed hard. If a man that close could be eliminated without hesitation, anyone could. Fear became policy. Associates measured their words like they were diffusing bombs. Meetings got shorter. Even eye contact became risky. A kind of grotesque competition developed among the men, each one trying to prove his loyalty louder, bigger, more extravagantly. Some kept meticulous notebooks, logging every order and task they'd completed, ready to show proof at a moment's notice. Others brought him expensive gifts, rare cigars, antique knives, Italian shoes, as if tribute could buy survival. Scarrow noticed it all, and he enjoyed it, not the gifts themselves, but the power they represented. Yet even as he basked in that control, he never truly believed in it. He installed a hypersensitive alarm system in his Atlantic City home, one that would alert him if a window moved even an inch. Sometimes he'd wake in the middle of the night just to test it, padding barefoot down the hall, a Beretta shoved into his waistband, eyes sweeping the shadows like they were full of ghosts. And maybe they were, because in Scarfo's world, the ghosts didn't wait for you to die. They were alive, breathing, smiling across the dinner table. They were men you'd toasted with the week before. They were nephews who swore blood loyalty, and the only way to survive was to strike before they could haunt you. It was a way of life that burned through allies, scared off potential partners, and turned every interaction into a test of nerves. But for Scarrow, it worked, for a while. Fear kept people in line. Money kept the engine running. And paranoia? That was his seatbelt, keeping him from crashing too soon. But even seatbelts fray. And Scarrow's? It was already showing threads. Nicodemos, Scarrow lived by one unshakable rule. The moment you decide you don't need to be ready is the moment you've signed your own death certificate. He didn't just preach that philosophy, he embodied it. To him, a man without his weapon might as well be walking blindfolded into traffic. In Scarrow's world, hesitation wasn't just dangerous, it was terminal. Business was booming, and his grip on Atlantic City tightened like a vice. The casinos were his stage, but construction sites, those were his gold mines. Every beam of steel, every yard of concrete, every inch of piping ran through his influence. If you wanted a major contract, you didn't waste time knocking on the doors of City Hall. You knocked on Scarrow's, metaphorically, of course. Nobody actually knocked on his real door unless they were invited, and the entry fee wasn't negotiable. Payments could be wrapped in a tidy brown envelope slid across a table, or buried deep inside fake invoices. Sometimes it was a cushy job for a cousin who never showed up to work, or a security consultation that was little more than a nod from the boss. Scarro didn't need to lift a hammer. All he needed was a spot on your payroll. And through his reach into the Laborers' International Union of North America, he controlled the real levers: labor costs, picket lines, and project schedules. On paper, it was all legitimate. In practice, it was a fortress of influence no lawman could walk through without a warrant and a prayer. Many who studied his rise believed that Scarro's true strength didn't lie in the threat of a bullet, but in the way he could twist legitimate systems into weapons that served him. Killing a man made you a suspect. Controlling the game so you never had to kill. That made you untouchable. As the cash poured in, Scarro allowed himself small indulgences, not the gaudy, diamond-studded lifestyle of other mob figures, but the subtle marks of someone who knew he'd earned his seat at the table. His suits were tailored razor-sharp, his watch ticked with the quiet authority of pure gold, and he bought a seaside condo. Though the curtains stayed shut tight, he appreciated fine wine, but rarely finished a glass. A man like him never dulled his senses. There were rules in his world, unwritten but carved deep into the minds of those who served him. One night, during an intimate dinner with his top men, a waiter dropped a spoon. The metallic clatter might as well have been a gunshot in the tense silence. Every head turned toward Scarro, waiting. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move quickly. He simply said, "Make sure he doesn't do that again." The waiter never returned. That was the lesson. In Scarfo's presence, every movement counted. Missteps weren't corrected. They were erased. By the early 80s, Scarro had evolved into something rare. A man who didn't just inspire fear. He curated it. Every tilt of his head, every pause before speaking, every calculated silence was designed to keep people off balance. And it worked. He didn't want friends at his table. He wanted people who sat up straight, who never asked who else might be coming, who didn't dare bring an outsider into the room. He didn't demand obedience. He engineered it. At the heart of his empire was a small circle of trusted and not so trusted men. Blood relatives like his nephew Leonetti mingled with soldiers whose loyalty had been tested in blood. Being close to Scarro meant basking in the heat of power, but it also meant living dangerously near the blast zone. Stories circulated, whispered with the certainty of urban legend. One claimed that during a sit-down, a made man let the faintest smirk slip across his face. Not laughter, not defiance, just a smirk. The next day, he was found dead, his larynx crushed. Official reports called it natural causes. Scarro never confirmed the tale. He just lit a cigarette and remarked, "Respect's a muscle. Let it go soft, and it won't hold up your mouth." True or not, it was enough to keep every smile in check. For all his ruthlessness, Scarro was no fool. He understood the balance. Too many bodies brought too much heat. Violence was his scalpel, not his sledgehammer. When a problem couldn't be solved with a bullet, he turned to subtler tools. A city councilman might receive a box of expensive cigars with a note, "For your father, my condolences." The man's father would be alive and well, but the message was crystal clear. "I know more about you than you think." Scarro kept notebooks, not lists of debts or names of enemies, but records of habits. Who sat with whom? Who arrived 5 minutes late to meetings? Who changed their routines without explanation? It wasn't just about gathering information. It was about noticing the shift before the storm. Some say he could have made a brilliant intelligence officer. In truth, he was something far more dangerous, an intelligence officer with no rules, no oversight, and no borders. Not every lieutenant thrived under his style. Chucky Marino, for example, was everything Scarro wasn't. Loud, flashy, the life of the party. For a time, Scarro valued him as a blunt instrument, a walking warning sign to anyone thinking about crossing the family. But the boss preferred his operators quiet, invisible. Marino was a walking headline. After a public bar fight that ended with gunfire, Scarro began pulling him out of the spotlight. No confrontations, no arguments, just fewer assignments, fewer meetings, and a quiet network of watchers tracking Marino's every move. The underboss's paranoia ate him alive. He drank more, spoke looser, and slowly unraveled under the kind of constant observation Scarro himself thrived under. To the boss, it was a disappointment, but not an unexpected one. Meanwhile, the FBI was burrowing deeper into his world. For years, they'd been planting wiretaps in bars, apartments, and restaurants. Every conversation about union deals, contract skims, or darker matters was potential evidence. Agents became obsessed with his speech patterns. He never said anything outright. A hit was having lunch with salt. A man causing problems was a dog that needs walking. His crew learned the language, even if they didn't always understand it. Somehow the meaning was always clear. By now, Scarro's life had become a stage play. Every interaction was a performance. Every man in his crew, an actor waiting for cues. He set the tempo, decided the scenes, and if an actor forgot his lines, well, the curtain came down quickly. His control wasn't just over the moves people made, it was over the very air they breathed in his presence. Under Scarfo's reign, every move inside his organization was like a scene from a high-stakes play, tightly scripted, perfectly timed, and unforgiving toward anyone who missed a cue. One misstep, and the curtain closed permanently. Take Salvatore Salvatessa. He was young, disciplined, and sharp enough to catch Scarfo's eye early on. At first, Scarfo seemed almost impressed, giving him opportunities that other rising soldiers would have killed for. But Salva had something Scarfo hated: momentum of his own. Rumors trickled in that he wasn't just carrying out orders, he was quietly building his own loyal circle. To Scarfo, that wasn't just a threat, it was treason in the making. The end came fast. Scarfo invited him to a friendly sit-down. They shook hands, smiles all around. A few hours later, Salva's body was found in a dimly lit parking lot riddled with bullets. No explanation, no theatrics, no condolences to the family. Scarfo didn't believe in waiting for proof. He believed in removing possibilities. That was the message to everyone at the table. Scarfo didn't just kill traitors. He killed potential traitors. It kept the machine running, fueled by fear as much as money. And the machine was running. Atlantic City was booming. Casinos roared, construction cranes swung over the skyline, unions fattened the treasury, and in every one of those cash flows, Scarfo's invisible hand was taking its cut. His power wasn't made of marble or gold, it was made of silence. The men in little Nicky's inner circle weren't just his crew. They were actors in a constant unscripted audition. At Scarfo's table, you sat upright. You answered directly. You laughed only when he laughed, and even then, just enough to be polite. Every meal could be a celebration or a setup. You never knew which until you were walking out the door or being carried. Scarfo's paranoia wasn't seasonal. It was constant, like background radiation. If he seemed relaxed, it wasn't because he trusted you. It was because he'd already made up his mind about you. And if that decision was bad, you wouldn't know until it was too late. He rotated safe houses like a man shuffling a deck of cards. A few nights in his Margate City townhouse, then a casino suite booked under someone else's name. He had different people check in for him, took different routes to the same places, shifted his morning walks without warning. One former driver later told the feds, he changed his routines more often than he changed his shirts. If they were driving, and a car behind them made the same two turns, Scarfo didn't just keep going. They'd pull into a gas station and sit there, sometimes for an hour. If they're thirsty, he'd say, they'll drink. Inside the organization, Scarfo ran his own brand of counterintelligence. Men watched other men. Captains were shadowed by lieutenants. Nobody, not even his most loyal soldier, was exempt. As he liked to put it, loyalty you can't prove isn't loyalty. It's just hope. And hope's for gamblers. That hyper-controlled paranoia only made his grip tighter. His word was law. His glance was gospel. Step out of line, whether from greed, ego, or simple human error, and punishment came swift. Raymond Long John Martirano found that out the hard way. A heavyweight in the Philadelphia family, Martirano had earned both respect and a reputation for being untouchable. But Scarfo started hearing whispers that Long John was expanding his rackets without permission, maybe even talking to other families out of town. Scarfo didn't waste time gathering evidence. He ordered the hit. In 1984, Martirano's car was lit up with bullets on a South Philly street. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't supposed to be. It was Scarfo's thunderclap, a warning to anyone else thinking about independence. Some say that was the moment Scarfo started hollowing out his own empire. A leader who ruled only by fear eventually runs out of followers. Isn't that the curse? Build an army too scared to act, and they stop acting at all. Still, the money poured in. Union kickbacks, loan sharking, gambling, construction rackets, casino skimming. The FBI later estimated that Scarfo's empire was pulling in over $30 million a year by the mid-'80s. Every dollar was cut with precision. His bookkeeper, a soft-spoken man named Anthony, kept ledgers so coded they read like riddles. Dry weather favors the painter. 2 coats, 1 brush. The feds eventually cracked the code, but not before Scarfo had turned a decade's worth of cash into silence, loyalty, and bricks-and-mortar investments. It was also, without a doubt, one of the bloodiest eras in Philly mob history. Between 1980 and 1989, more than 30 mob-connected killings were linked directly or indirectly to Scarfo. That's more than the entire Bruno era combined. And yet for all that bloodshed, Scarfo himself stayed oddly composed. He never screamed in public, never threw chairs or broke glasses in fits of rage. When he was angry, his voice just dropped lower. His sentences got shorter. That was the real warning. Phil Leonetti, his own nephew, once said, "You didn't need to hear a threat." You could see it in the space between his words. But fear is a fragile thing. Over time, cracks began to show. Some of the younger associates thought the murders were excessive. Older hands worried the FBI was closing in. Scarfo noticed all of it and suspected everyone. One night, during a meeting in what was supposed to be a clean house, he looked around the table and asked 3 of his top lieutenants, "If I dropped dead tonight, who takes over?" Silence. He asked again. Finally, one man said, "You'd never let that happen." Scarfo smiled. "That's the right answer." The man was never invited to another meeting again. Even his personal pleasures carried a watchful edge. He liked evening walks along the beach. Never in daylight, never the same path twice. He enjoyed Sinatra, but only on cassette tapes, never the radio. He was obsessed with a particular red sauce from a diner on Ventnor Avenue, but had 3 people taste it before he'd take a bite himself. When someone asked why, he said, "Even salt looks like sugar." That's how guys die smiling. Scarfo thought he was untouchable. His paranoia was his armor, his fear-mongering his shield. But while he kept his eyes on the street, the FBI had their ears above his head. Bugs in ceilings, wires in walls. Every word, every hint, every coded phrase was being recorded. In the end, Nicodemo Scarfo wouldn't be brought down by a rival's bullet or a street betrayal. His fall would come from the one place he wasn't looking, from above. The fall of Nicodemo, little Nicky. Scarfo didn't happen in a cinematic burst of gunfire or a bloody coup in a dimly lit restaurant. It happened quietly, under his own ceiling, while Scarfo was obsessed with watching his rear-view mirror, zigzagging through city streets to throw off imagined tales. The FBI was already in his home, literally. They had slipped into his world without the creak of a floorboard. Microphones, hidden lamps, wires threaded through the ceiling, recorders disguised as cigarette packs, even bugs sewn into the buttonholes of coats. Scarfo had spent years cultivating an aura of omniscience, but now every nod, every half-finished sentence, every coded phrase about taking a walk or delivering the package was captured and cataloged by federal agents who were content to let the real roll. It didn't start with Scarfo himself. It started with a weak link. A mid-level soldier named Nicholas Nicky Crow Caramandi got picked up on the usual mob menu: gambling, extortion, maybe a little light intimidation work. In the old days, A man in his position would have kept his mouth shut, done his time, and worn his silence like a badge of honor. But Caramandi wasn't built for the long haul. Faced with the weight of prison, and perhaps the even heavier weight of Scarfo's unpredictable temper, he flipped. And when one domino fell, the rest began to teeter. One by one, other associates, men who had once toasted Scarfo at weddings and kissed his ring at meetings, decided the FBI's offer was more appealing than either a bullet or a lifetime behind bars. Fear of Scarfo had once kept them loyal. Now, that same fear drove them to talk. After all, this was a man who didn't just punish betrayal. He punished the mere possibility of it. The Bureau started stitching together the fragments. They charted which envelopes arrived on Thursdays, who picked up the veal cutlets every other Friday, who liked to use the phrase walk the dog when talking about murder. They didn't just track movements. They mapped Scarfo's entire world, from casino skimming operations to union kickbacks. Through it all, Scarfo went on, as if untouchable, conducting meetings, handing down orders, deciding who lived and who didn't. But every word he spoke was being recorded, time-stamped, and filed into manila folders labeled with his name. One agent even called him the most quotable mob boss in modern history. Then came 1986. The trap snapped shut. The indictments came in layers. RICO violations, extortion, conspiracy, murder. It wasn't one case. It was a web. Each thread led back to Scarfo, the man who thought silence was his greatest weapon. But the very men he'd taught to speak in half sentences were now providing the FBI with the missing pieces. Some say Scarfo could have walked away if he'd retired after securing Atlantic City, if he'd quit while his name still carried fear instead of inevitability. But power rarely grants a graceful exit. It always asks for just one more move, one more favor, one more year. When the agents came for him, Scarfo didn't run. He didn't rage. Wearing a silk bathrobe and slippers, he sat at his table in Ventnor, staring at the blinds, a cold cup of coffee beside him. If anything, he looked like a man who had been expecting the knock on the door for years. At his arraignment, he smirked, not out of humor, but because inevitability had finally caught up. The trials were public theater, packed courtrooms, swarming reporters, crackling wiretap audio played for juries. The transcripts read like hard-boiled fiction, blunt, menacing fragments of conversation that left little room for interpretation. Scarfo sat quietly through it all, scribbling notes, occasionally glaring, but never losing that eerie composure. And then came the blow he didn't see coming. Phil Leonetti, his nephew, his protege, his underboss, flipped. This wasn't just any betrayal. It was personal. Scarfo had raised Phil in the life, teaching him the art of both business and survival. How to stand in court without flinching, how to read a man's intentions in the shift of his weight, how to spot treachery before it bloomed. Now Leonetti was on the other side of the courtroom, dismantling his uncle's empire piece by piece. He confirmed the murders, explained the codes, and laid out the operations like an accountant itemizing debts. Those in the room said Scarfo's face didn't change once during Phil's testimony. No shouting, no denial, just stone. The verdicts piled up. 14 years for racketeering, then more sentences for other charges. Eventually, life. He was sent to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, where he still tried to run what was left of his organization. Notes were passed, coded letters sent through visitors, but the engine was broken. His best men were dead or had switched sides. The money streams were clogged, and the fear he once commanded had evaporated. Nicodemo Scarfo became one of the rare mafia bosses to die in prison without ever tasting freedom again. Inside, he clung to routine. Same stiff walk, same corner of the yard, same breakfast, hard-boiled eggs, toast, black coffee. One guard said he didn't age, he calcified. He never admitted guilt, even as transcripts and testimonies stacked higher than the prison walls. They don't know what loyalty means, he told one interviewer. Not anymore. But the truth was, The punishment that bit deepest wasn't the steel gates or the concrete cell. It was irrelevance. Outside, new names rose to prominence. Deals were made without him. Atlantic City, once his playground, had turned corporate. Nobody was asking what little Nicky thought anymore. His cell was modest, no view of the ocean he'd once walked beside at dusk, no room for pacing like he used to in his penthouse suites. A few books on war and Italian history sat on the shelf, alongside a battered copy of The Prince and a legal pad he rarely touched. His meals arrived on plastic trays, and the only decision left to him was whether to eat the top half or bottom half of his banana first. Still, Scarfo resisted fading away completely. He kept sending out coded instructions, hiding messages in recipes or family anecdotes, but the machine he had built no longer ran on intimidation. It needed fresh blood, active rackets, the kind of constant pressure only a free man could apply. The world had moved on without him. The mafia of the 1980s was not the mafia of the 1970s. Surveillance was sharper, informants easier to turn, juries bolder. Even the air of untouchability was gone. It had been replaced with mugshots on the evening news. And so, little Nicky Scarfo, once the most feared man in Philadelphia and Atlantic City, spent his last years as just another inmate, pacing the same patch of prison yard, replaying in his mind the days when a single glance could seal a man's fate. In the end, the silence he had used to control others became the silence that swallowed him whole. The Atlantic City that Scarfo once bent to his will had transformed into something unrecognizable. The casinos that once served as his personal gold mines now had corporate owners, glossy accounting departments, and endless walls of surveillance cameras. The famous boardwalk was no longer a playground for men who ruled in whispers. It was lined with tax-paying businesses and blinking neon signs promising family-friendly fun. For Scarfo, there was no space left in this new, sanitized world. But the harshest blows weren't from federal agents or shifting city landscapes. They came from the people closest to him. Old allies who had once toasted to his health began showing up on witness lists. Letters from lifelong friends stopped arriving, and then came the tragedy that could break any father. In the early 1990s, his son Mark attempted suicide. Mark survived physically, but was left in a permanent vegetative state. Scarfo never spoke about it publicly. Not in interviews, not in letters, not even in the coded messages he sent to the few men still loyal to him. But prison guards noticed. The man who once strutted the yard with that unmistakable boss's stride now walked shorter, slower laps. His commissary orders grew smaller. He stopped requesting his favorite snacks. It was as if the constant flame that had powered him through decades of war, betrayal, and ambition had dimmed to a faint ember. And yet, even with age creeping in, danger still clung to him. One inmate who shared a block with Scarfo recalled, "He had that look. If they opened those gates tomorrow, he'd be back in business before dinner." You didn't let your guard down around him. You didn't talk too freely. Even in his 70s, Scarfo moved with the instincts of a man expecting an ambush. He always sat with his back to the wall. His conversations were clipped, and if you repeated yourself, you'd get no more than a raised eyebrow and a flat, "You talk too much." That was his way of ending a conversation. The Bureau of Prisons kept moving him, bouncing him from one high-security facility to another. The official reason was administrative, but everyone knew the truth. They were trying to sever what was left of his influence. And still the transfers only added to his legend. To new inmates, he was a living artifact, the man who had run Philadelphia's underworld like a chessboard. To the guards, he was a walking cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most untouchable eventually end up in the system's grip. Even after decades behind bars, Scarfo's name would occasionally find its way back into headlines. In the mid-2000s, his son, Nicodemo Scarfo Jr., was linked to a credit card fraud scheme involving members of New Jersey's Lucchese crime family. Prosecutors quietly wondered if the old man had offered more than fatherly advice from his cell. Some suspected that even in the shadows, Scarfo was still giving orders. But no one outruns time. What the FBI, rival gangs, and courtrooms couldn't accomplish, age managed with cruel efficiency. Scarfo's once solid frame shrank. His voice lost its bite. The man who had made entire neighborhoods tremble now shuffled slowly to medical checkups and fell asleep in the middle of loud television shows playing in the prison common room. Yet the paranoia, that never left. One guard swore Scarfo once asked to be moved because the shadows in the corner of his cell looked different. Another said the old boss would wake in the dead of night to check that his cell door was still locked from the inside. Even when surrounded by concrete and steel, Scarfo kept seeing angles, threats, and possibilities that most men had long given up thinking about. In his mind, the game had never ended. It had just slowed down. He had climbed from a scrappy, ambitious kid on the Philly streets to a man who could order life and death with a phone call. And now? Now he was a low murmur in a prison hallway, a name that only carried weight in history books. Still, even whispers can echo, especially when they belong to someone who never once said, "I'm sorry." Life behind bars settled into a gray, endless rhythm. Days bled together until they felt interchangeable. Breakfast, a short walk in the yard. Lunch, back to the cell. Dinner, and maybe another trip outside if the weather was good. Lights out came at 10 p.m., though Scarfo didn't need the warning. He knew from a lifetime in the life. Nothing good happens after lights out. The man who had once orchestrated empires now organized paperbacks. He requested books from the prison library, war histories, biographies of dictators, and manuals on military strategy. When asked what drew him to them, his answer was always the same. They don't stutter when they give orders. He never touched fiction. It wasn't about disbelief. It was about utility. If something didn't have real-world application, Scarfo didn't see the point. Even the few visitors who still came learned to avoid small talk. If you sat down across the bulletproof glass and started reminiscing, "Hey, remember the old days?" Scarfo would tilt his head, blinking slowly, as if deciding whether your nostalgia had any strategic value. And if it didn't, the conversation quickly shifted back to what mattered. Who was out? Who was climbing the ranks? And who was running their mouth? His body was trapped behind concrete walls, but his mind roamed far beyond them. Through coded letters, the occasional smuggled newspaper clipping, and whispers from other inmates, Scarfo kept a surprisingly accurate pulse on the outside world. Retired federal agents admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that the man seemed to know things before they were officially announced, which prosecutors had been reassigned, which inmates were quietly cooperating, even cell block transfers that hadn't yet gone public. One former agent joked, "It's like he had antennae in places we didn't even know had radios." But knowing didn't bring comfort. If anything, it was a slow drip of bad news. The old crew had scattered. Some had flipped to save themselves. Others had faded into obscurity. A few lay buried in cemeteries Scarfo himself had once chosen for them. Their headstones were spotless, but their histories were stained beyond repair. And every year that passed, Scarfo's own name became a smaller entry in the annals of mob history, wedged between bosses who had stolen more headlines. To the FBI, he was still a case study in the rise and fall of organized crime. To new recruits in law enforcement, he was a warning. No matter how high you climb, prison has a seat waiting for you. They used to study him like he was a case file wrapped in skin. New FBI recruits would sit in dim rooms, headphones clamped tight, listening to recordings of the man's voice. Not loud, not frantic, just deliberate, calculated pauses. Words chosen like bullets, each one carrying a target. He didn't need to say "kill him" for the meaning to land. The euphemisms were sharp enough to cut through any doubt, and the men listening knew exactly what he meant. In time, Scarfo became more than a criminal in their eyes. He was a curriculum. His trials, his wiretaps, his coded conversations, they became teaching material for a new generation of lawmen. His downfall, alongside other big names of the 1980s, would forever change how organized crime was dismantled in America. The old ways, the Tommy gun shootouts, the car chases, the raids that ended in bloody stairwells, gave way to something quieter, deadlier. Paper trails, RICO indictments, wiretaps. The fight moved from street corners to courtrooms. Some said that if he'd been born in another era, one without RICO laws, without relentless electronic surveillance, Scarro might have gone on ruling his empire for decades longer. But the modern world caught up to his methods, and when it did, the fall was permanent. The years didn't just pass, they pressed down on him. Small strokes stole pieces of his strength. His once precise hands trembled when signing his name. Getting out of bed became a process, and some days he didn't bother. The prison offered him a wheelchair, but pride kept him leaning on a cane instead. And when even the cane wasn't enough, he'd casually brace himself against a wall, as if it were just another habit, not a necessity. Yet vanity, that old ally, refused to leave him. His hair stayed combed, his nails trimmed with precision. Wrinkled laundry earned a quiet scolding for the guard who brought it. "I ain't dead yet," he said, and it wasn't bravado. It was a reminder to himself that some things, however small, were still his to control. For Scarro, control wasn't about money anymore. It was about details, his posture, his shoes, and most of all, his name. "What's the difference between a story and a reputation?" he once asked a cellmate. "One fades." When a prison newsletter misspelled his last name in an article about mob history, he sent a single-line letter to the warden. "Names are earned. Please don't misspell mine. No anger, just fact." In time, they moved him to the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina. This wasn't the high-tension lockup of his younger days. It was a place for old men, sick men, or both. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and canned fruit. The hallways were wide, the walls pale. But the guards got the same warning every time a new inmate asked about him. Low movement, high alert. Don't confuse the two. Even here, among wheelchairs and slow shuffles, Scarro carried himself like a man expecting the lights to go out mid-meal, like danger could still step through the door at any moment. Once, a fellow inmate wheeled past him and said, "You Scarfo?" He didn't answer, just tapped his cane twice on the floor. A signal, a habit, maybe both. His kingdom had shrunk to a handful of corridors, a shared TV in the common room, and the endless white tiles above his bed. The hands that once orchestrated empires now shook as they gripped a soup spoon. His eyes, once razor-sharp, reading a man's intentions in a single glance, had dimmed. But behind the slower movements, behind the quiet, there was still that locked vault mind. He spoke rarely, but when he did, every word felt loaded. A nurse once asked him, "Need anything?" His answer, "A different century." And he meant it. Even his habits stayed rooted in the old ways. If his seat didn't face the door, he'd position himself near a reflective surface to watch the hallway behind him. In this place of scheduled pills and check-ins, he still ran his own kind of surveillance. Letters came sometimes, from old associates, from distant relatives, from complete strangers. Wannabe wise guys, amateur historians, or just curious souls hoping for a response. Most went unanswered, but one he kept. A letter from the son of a man who'd once served under him. "My father used to say your word was law," the young man wrote, "that you never repeated yourself, never forgave, but always treated a man fair. Was that true?" Scarro never replied, but he folded the letter carefully, slid it between the pages of a battered copy of The Prince, the same book he'd kept for years. Many believed that he went to his grave without an ounce of regret, not for what he'd done anyway. He believed in order, in consequence, in loyalty. He believed the rules he enforced kept worse chaos at bay. To him, that wasn't evil. That was necessity. In the last months, nurses noticed him, muttering to himself, not in confusion, but like a man working through a problem only he could solve. Sometimes it was names, sometimes dates, sometimes a few clipped phrases in Italian. No old friends came to see him. Not Phil Leonetti. Not the few men still alive from his Atlantic City circle. What surrounded him in the end wasn't a crew or rivals or even family, just orderlies with clipboards, nurses making quiet rounds, and the steady tick of institutional time. January 13th, 2017, arrived without fanfare. Nicodemos Scarfo died that day. Natural causes. Age 87. No headlines big enough to match the fear his name once carried. No crowds outside the prison gates. Just the quiet passing of a man who'd once ruled a city and ended his days in a wheelchair, watching his reflection in the glass. Still somewhere, in some small corner of law enforcement training, his voice plays on old tapes. Young agents lean in, listening, trying to learn how a man can say so little and mean so much. There was no grand procession, no long line of black Cadillacs crawling behind the hearse, no cluster of men in dark coats guarding the grave like sentinels. His departure from the world was quiet, almost bureaucratic, a body transported under supervision, lowered into the earth with only the barest handful of witnesses. No speeches, no eulogies, no nods to the life he'd lived. Just a name, etched in stone, a pair of dates, and a silence so heavy it could have stretched across decades. The man who once made a city grip its steering wheel tighter at night, whose presence could thin the air in a room, had become just another number in the system. Another inmate lost to the slow erosion of time. And yet in Philadelphia and Atlantic City, his shadow hasn't entirely vanished. It lingers in places you wouldn't expect. In the smell of cigarette smoke that clings to certain stairwells, in the muffled conversations behind the doors of old union halls, in the stories still traded among casino construction crews who swear they remember how it used to be. Deep in federal archives, under lock and key, there are hours of surveillance footage, grainy, static-filled tapes, where his voice still cuts through like cold steel. And there's a story, one that floats somewhere between rumor and gospel, that one of the last things he ever said was, "I walked through walls they never saw being built." Whether it was truth, bravado, or the fog of an old man's final days, doesn't really matter. It sounded like him. And that's the thing. The most dangerous men don't always leave a trail of explosions. Sometimes they leave barely a footprint, but those who knew where to look could still find them everywhere. In the months and years after Nicodemos Scarfo was gone, there were no candlelight vigils, no slick documentaries rushing to air, no somber barrooms where wise guys lowered their heads in unspoken mourning. The world moved on, but for those who had lived through his reign, the years when the city itself felt like a pressure cooker, the memory was still alive in strange corners of South Philadelphia. Walk into certain social clubs, and you could feel it in the air. You wouldn't see a plaque or a portrait. Scarro's name wasn't something you displayed, but you'd notice how certain chairs were never taken, how conversations paused for just a beat when someone mentioned the early 80s. Even decades later, his name still surfaced in union meetings, not as a threat exactly, but as a warning. An old-timer might lean back in his chair and mutter, "Let's not have another Scarfo situation." Nobody would ask for clarification. They knew. The fear he commanded back then wasn't just about who lived and who didn't. It was about the tone he set, a constant low hum of tension. He had turned the whole city into a chessboard, and in his game, even the pawns bled. Men unplugged their phones before going to bed. Dinners were toasted like they might be someone's last. Meetings felt less like business and more like auditions for survival. Atlantic City glittered again after his time, but some things never returned. His fingerprints were pressed deep into the foundations, sometimes literally. Construction workers still whispered about jobs where the concrete was poured too fast, permits that sailed through without explanation, or odd little businesses that ran on baffling schedules no one dared question. Like that pizzeria that closed every Tuesday at 4 o'clock sharp. Nobody knew why. Nobody asked. If you really think about it, Scarro's greatest legacy might not have been in the bodies or the money. It was in the habits he left behind. And ironically, many believed that his brutality, his very excesses, had given law enforcement the clearest blueprint yet on how to dismantle a mob. His downfall became a teaching aid. At the FBI Academy, new recruits studied him like a case study in human control. They listened to digitized recordings of his conversations. The way he could casually hand out a death sentence between mouthfuls of pasta. The way silence sometimes hit harder than any order. Even his vague phrases, "We'll take care of it," or "He's not with us anymore," were examined for what they revealed about coded communication. In the textbooks, Scarrow wasn't a ghost story. He was a lesson plan. But outside the federal files, there were still a few people in South Philly who held a different picture of the man. Men who were older now, slower, their hair grayed or gone, who remembered moments that didn't make the headlines. They'd talk about the time he paid for a kid's braces because the family couldn't afford them, or how he once tipped a waitress $100 just for making sure his coffee stayed hot. They didn't excuse the violence. Nobody did. But they remembered a man who believed in rules. They were rules that could be cruel, even fatal, but they were rules nonetheless. One barber still swears he remembers every detail. Scarro would always come in on Wednesdays, take the chair by the window, never wore the barber's cape, said he liked to see his hands while they worked. If you asked how short, he'd just say, "Clean." Nothing fancy, just clean. And that's the cut he gave him for 15 years straight. When asked if he missed him, the barber just shrugged. "I miss people who don't repeat themselves," he said. Even that, he admitted, felt like a lesson Scarro left behind, because maybe that's the truth of it. Scarro's reign was about more than the crimes. It was about a certain way of moving through the world, a way that taught everyone around him to measure their words, to think twice before speaking, to always watch the door. And when he was gone, that way of living didn't disappear completely. It just went underground, into the quiet spaces between conversations, into the pauses that still hang in certain rooms. By the early 2000s and 20s, the streets of Philadelphia had changed their rhythm. The faces at the top of the underworld food chain were younger, their methods more discreet, their ambitions wrapped in LLCs and shell corporations instead of backroom oaths. They weren't the kind to send a message with a bullet in broad daylight. Their power moved through contracts, silent investors, and quiet buyouts. But the old-timers, the ones who had seen the city under a different kind of grip, kept the memory alive. They would sip coffee in the corners of social clubs, lean forward, and talk in half-whispers about an era when one man could drain the air from a room without so much as raising his eyebrows. A time when Atlantic City's boardwalk seemed to have a silent guardian in loafers, his presence felt but rarely seen. Phil Leonetti, Scarro's nephew and once his trusted underboss, had long since traded shadows for daylight. Witness protection, tell-all books, and interview circuits became his new trade. His words dismantled the empire that had once made him untouchable. Yet in candid moments, even Leonetti confessed that Scarro was the most intimidating man he had ever known. And not because he was loud. Scarro's menace was quieter, more calculated. His silence had a way of walking into a room before he did, and it still seemed to linger decades later in neighborhoods where a look could seal a deal more firmly than a handshake. There was no statue in his honor, no neatly kept grave with flowers refreshed each January. His legacy didn't live in memorials. It lived in the way people told his story. Lowered voices, a sideways glance, a pause long enough for the unspoken to hang in the air. In the unwritten rule book of the streets, Scarro had left behind a permanent footnote. The quiet ones are the ones to watch. Even now, if you go looking in South Jersey, really looking, not just passing through, you might catch his shadow in unexpected places. Behind the counter of a corner store, in the half-muted laughter at a union hall, in the way certain eyes narrow when his name surfaces. His ghost doesn't rattle chains or slam doors. It strolls in soft-soled shoes, leaving no trail. Because Scarro didn't simply wield fear. He refined it, taught it to walk upright, to speak softly, to smile before it struck. One of the most misunderstood truths about his reign was how small his actual operation was. His trusted lieutenants could be counted on two hands. His inner circle was tighter still, and yet his reach was sprawling, stretching from neighborhood bars to city unions, from construction sites to courtroom corridors. At his peak, A single call from Scarro could freeze a multi-million-dollar project, derail a political fundraiser, or change a man's fate before nightfall. That wasn't just muscle, that was theater. That was the art of control. Scarro understood better than most that perception could be more powerful than presence. You don't need to be the biggest, he once told a close confidant. You just need them to think you're everywhere. That philosophy didn't just intimidate rivals, it corroded trust within his own ranks. A man didn't have to see Scarro's eyes in the room. The possibility that he might be watching was enough to alter behavior. Judges treaded lightly, prosecutors tightened their cases, cops thought twice before getting comfortable. Even his own men learned to communicate in nods and half-finished sentences. There's an old story, still told in back rooms, about a low-level associate who once delivered a plain envelope to Scarro in the early equities. No threats, no instructions. Scarro just stared at the man for 7 silent seconds before walking away. That was it. No words, no handshake. The man claimed that look stuck with him for life, so much so that he walked away from the mob within a year. Scarro didn't inspire loyalty in the romanticized sense. He inspired compliance. That's an important difference. While some bosses sought headlines, John Gotti with his flashbulb smiles and designer coats comes to mind. Scarro ducked from the spotlight like it was a loaded gun. His pastel suits weren't there to draw attention, but to contrast the darkness that lived behind his eyes. When a courthouse reporter once tried to corner him with questions, Scarro brushed him off with a single line. If I needed to explain myself, you wouldn't be qualified to hear it. He didn't waste words. Every syllable had a purpose, and that purpose was usually to close a conversation. Some say he was born in the wrong era, that if he'd come up in Luciano's or Capone's day, he'd have been a king among gangsters. Others argue the opposite, that he was perfectly suited for the modern age of wiretaps and informants, because his obsession with control thrived in a world where every word could be recorded and every move could be traced. Before Scarro, the Philadelphia mob under Angelo Bruno had been known for relative stability, a business-first operation where peace was part of the profit strategy. After Scarro, the family's name became shorthand for bloodshed and suspicion. Under his rule, loyalty wasn't a lifetime pass. It was a daily test. A made man who didn't produce results was watched. A capo who got too friendly with outsiders was watched harder. Even whispers of hesitation were treated like early signs of betrayal. And when someone disappeared, no one asked questions. The silence was its own answer. This atmosphere didn't evaporate after his arrest. Through the 90s and into the 2000s, successors tried to resurrect the Bruno way. Quiet, diplomatic, less volatile, but Scarro's ghost was always in the room, a reminder of what happened when peace was mistaken for weakness. His influence had sunk into the foundations of the Philadelphia mob, like old rebar in cracked concrete, unseen but still holding weight. Even the FBI found lasting value in his case. Internal training materials used Scarro as a case study, not just on how to catch a mobster, but how to understand one. His methods became lessons, the calculated pauses, the coded language, the way fear could be woven into every handshake, every toast, every casual, "we'll take care of it." By the end of his life, his body may have been failing, but his reputation never did. He didn't need the public to remember his name. It was enough that the men who came after him did, and they did. Even now, in federal lockups, when a young inmate starts strutting too loud, an old-timer might mutter, "He thinks he's Scarro." That doesn't mean strong. It doesn't mean smart. It means dangerous, unrelenting, alone. He was called many things over the years. The little guy, the quiet one, the pajama don. The nicknames were half mockery, half acknowledgement that someone so physically unassuming could cast such a deep and unsettling shadow over an entire city. And maybe that was his greatest weapon, the disconnect between appearance and reality. He didn't need height to tower over a room. By the time the final chapter of Nicodemo's little Nicky Scarro's life began to play out, the force of his presence had already started to dim, but never completely. His power had never been in a loud command or a dramatic gesture. It was in the seconds people hesitated before speaking, the way a sentence would stumble halfway through because the speaker suddenly wondered if they should be saying it at all. That hesitation had always been his real weapon. He didn't bark orders to get attention, nor did he jab a finger to guide a man's steps. His influence worked like gravity. You didn't see it, but the moment he walked into a room, it pulled at you. Conversations slowed, eyes shifted, and every decision, no matter how small, tilted in his direction. For decades, that gravity bent every space he entered. But gravity, like all forces, eventually gives way. In the last stretch of his life, Scarro wasn't in the back rooms of South Philly or pacing the glitzy floors of Atlantic City casinos. He was in a federal medical facility in Butner, North Carolina, a place where the walls didn't echo with schemes, but with the squeak of nurses' shoes on worn linoleum. The once feared mob boss lived surrounded by men who, like him, had once commanded cities and now waited quietly for medication carts and breakfast trays. One nurse recalled him sitting perfectly still for hours, his eyes fixed not on the television in the corner, but on something far away, something only he could see. Maybe it was the polished wood of a corner booth in an Atlantic City restaurant, the stale coffee aroma of a South Philly diner, or the view from a quiet street where business was done without words. Whether he was remembering, calculating, or dismantling something in his mind, she couldn't tell. When the end came, it was without ceremony. No press gathered outside, no crowd of mourners waited in the halls. He slipped away under a thin government-issued blanket, taking one last breath before silence reclaimed him. And this is where the story slows. We step back from the buzzing casinos, the coded conversations, the courtroom dramas. Instead, imagine the Atlantic City boardwalk long after midnight. The tourists are gone. The air is heavy with salt and faint traces of fried food from a closed stand. The boards creak under the weight of no one's footsteps. Somewhere overhead, a lone gull circles. The city feels paused, as if it's holding something back. That's where Scarro remains, in the stillness, in the thin line between a whisper and a warning. Men like him don't reappear in back rooms or prison yards. They aren't built to last. They burn hot and leave only a trace of ash behind. A reminder that real fear rarely raises its voice. After his death, his name didn't echo in the streets the way it once had. Instead, it turned up in law school lectures, in organized crime panels, in court transcripts cited by prosecutors and historians. His career was dissected in interviews and FBI case studies, broken into bullet points and redacted paragraphs. Many men who live in infamy are softened in retelling, transformed into cinematic legends or misunderstood anti-heroes. Scarro never received that treatment. His reputation didn't blur into myth. It stayed sharp, as cold as the day he'd built it. He'd never cared for public attention. Unlike mobsters who posed for cameras or played the media like a violin, Scarro's stage was the room he was in, and the few who occupied it. The less the public knew, the better. His clothes were tailored, his demeanor controlled, but none of it was for show. If anything, it was to disguise the steel running through him. Those who stood against him called him unpredictable. Those who served under him, at least the ones who survived, called him disciplined. And his family, in rare moments of honesty, admitted he seemed exhausted even in his prime. In one of his trials, a court stenographer actually paused to confirm she'd heard him right when he said, "I trust routine more than I trust people." He had meant it word for word. For him, routine wasn't just habit, it was control. Who he saw, where he parked, when he ate, every action was a small assertion of power over his environment. Even in prison, stripped of most choices, he clung to the little ones. A certain time for coffee, a particular seat at the table. The Bureau of Prisons could dictate the walls around him, but not how he moved inside them. As the years passed, even the men who had once feared him began to see him as something else. A cautionary tale carved into the history of the Philadelphia mob. A man who grasped so tightly at control that he crushed much of what he'd built. Still, in certain corners, his name carried a different weight. Not admiration, not fondness, but a kind of reluctant respect. Because for all his flaws, Scarro had been a teacher. His lesson was simple. Fear works until it doesn't. Phil Leonetti, his nephew, and once loyal underboss, lived to tell parts of that story from the safety of witness protection. In one interview, Leonetti summed up his feelings with words that lingered long after. I loved him. I feared him. And I'm not sure I ever knew him. It's the kind of statement that sticks with you. How do you love someone you never truly understood? How do you fear the same man who invited you into his world, only to one day cast you out without warning? Leonetti had bled for Scarro, lied for him, taken lives for him, and like so many before him, he eventually walked away. Not because he wanted to, but because Scarro's loyalty had a shelf life. You never knew the expiration date until it was already behind you. In the end, that might have been Scarro's greatest failing. Not his violence, not his greed, but his inability or unwillingness to let anyone close enough to stay. He built walls instead of bridges, and walls make for a lonely final chapter. That's exactly how it ended. One man in one room, surrounded by silence, too heavy for anyone to carry with them. Afterward, a few newspapers printed short obituaries, no bigger than the ones for men who'd spent their lives entirely outside the law. For the public, it was just another headline, fading into yesterday's news. For the few who had stood in his shadow, it was a reminder that power and fear don't come with an afterlife. They fade the moment the man who carried them is gone. In the neighborhoods where his name once hung in the air like smoke, you won't find statues or plaques. But every so often, you might notice a pause in conversation, a tightening of the eyes, a quick change of subject. That's where he lives now, in the reflexes he left behind. And maybe that's the truest mark of his legacy. Not in the streets he ruled, but in the hesitation he still commands, long after his voice went silent. He was the kind of man whose presence rewrote the temperature of a room. Not with a shout, not with a grand gesture, just by being there. Nicodemo's little Nicky. Scarro didn't need noise to be noticed. The silence that followed him around was loud enough. One Atlantic City columnist once summed it up perfectly in a short, almost throwaway piece they titled, "The Man Who Looked at You," like he already knew the ending. The writer recalled spotting Scarro sometime in the early 1980s. No entourage, no nervous cops trailing him, no maidmen watching the door. Just Scarro, slipping into a small-town diner like any other customer. He sat alone at a corner booth, his back against the wall, eyes tracking every movement without appearing to. Ordered eggs and rye toast, black coffee, no sugar. He looked like a man with nowhere particular to be, but who still wouldn't trust you to sit where you could get behind him. That was his style, his mark on the world. The power wasn't in the volume, it was in the stillness. Years later, the places that had once been his strongholds were different. The diner had been torn down. The casino he'd quietly siphoned from had been gutted and remodeled, its walls stripped of their secrets. The back rooms where whispers had carried orders now just smelled of stale carpet and broken heating vents. But here's the strange thing. Every so often, someone still stops in those spaces. Maybe an aging bartender. Maybe a cop who was young when Scarro was in his prime. They'll look around and say, almost automatically, "This is where little Nicky used to sit." Not fondly, not bitterly. Just stating a fact. Because when a shadow has been cast long enough, you still see its outline even after the light changes. When Scarro's empire finally collapsed, something curious happened. Something that always seems to follow the fall of men like him. The legend began to split into two versions. The first was the official one, built from court transcripts, mugshots, wiretap recordings, and heavily redacted FBI files. This version had numbers, body counts, prison sentences, dollar amounts skimmed from casinos. It was measurable, documented, cited in law enforcement briefings. The second version was the one you only heard after midnight over coffee that had been reheated too many times, in voices that dropped just a little before saying his name. The whispered, "Little Nicky" version. Polished by fear, sharpened by memory, and blurred by time. Not necessarily more accurate, but far more dangerous. And it was that ghost version of Scarro that stuck around longer than the man himself. Kids, born long after his reign, still heard about him from uncles or older brothers. You think you got problems? Try living through Nicky's time. It didn't matter if the stories were true, they only had to be useful. Scarro became a warning, a quiet one, the kind that didn't need to shout to be remembered. His whisper once turned boardwalk strolls into dangerous territory and made breakfast diners feel like courtrooms without judges. That influence doesn't disappear when a man dies. It seeps into the wood of the boardwalk, into the habits of people who've never even met him, into the half-second pauses in conversation when his name comes up. Even law enforcement felt it. Many of the agents who'd spent their careers chasing him eventually retired, but they passed on his file to the next generation. They told stories about how Scarro never said, "kill him outright," how he'd used 3 different phones just to make one call, how a single phrase, "handle it," could mean the end of someone's life. Some rookie agents laughed it off until they listened to the tapes, until they heard the way a low chuckle could sound more like a death sentence than a threat. Scarro's legacy wasn't a monument, it was a methodology. In the years after his death, the low-budget documentaries started popping up. Titles like Scarro, The Don Who Didn't Blink. The production values were cheap. Slow pans over black and white mugshots, interviews with old associates hidden in shadow, their voices disguised to sound like gravel in a tin can. Journalists debated endlessly. Was Scarro paranoid or just painfully precise? One historian offered a sharper angle. Scarro didn't just commit crimes, he curated consequences. And it was true. To him, every move was part of a cold equation. If a man missed a meeting, that man would soon be missing altogether. If money came up short, lights went out, sometimes permanently. This wasn't emotion, it was math, and in Scarro's math, there was no room for remainders. Even now, decades later, his name still pops up in modern mob trials. In 2021, a judge sentencing a Jersey mobster told the courtroom, "We are no longer in the days of Scarro. This court does not operate under fear." But the mention alone proved the opposite. His ghost still sat at the defense table. His son, Nicodemo, managed to dance on the edges of the law for years. More white-collar than street muscle, but still carrying that last name like a brand that wouldn't fade. But the truth? There was only ever one Scarro worth fearing, and by the time that Scarro lay dying in federal custody, what remained was more myth than man. But that's the thing about legends. They're not about accuracy, they're about purpose. And for 2 generations in Philadelphia and Atlantic City, the purpose of Scarro's name was simple. He was the story you told when someone got too comfortable, when a new face thought respect could be demanded instead of earned, when a cocky kid cracked a joke in the wrong bar and needed to understand that silence could be deadlier than swagger. Some still argue that Scarro changed the mob forever, that his scorched earth way of ruling burned the Philadelphia family from the inside. Before him, it was feared. After him, it was fractured. And every boss who followed inherited the paranoia, the echoes, and the chilling sense that somewhere in the room, Scarro had already read your thoughts. One retired FBI agent told a story that still makes the rounds. At a seminar on organized crime, someone asked him who the most frightening mobster he'd ever dealt with was. He didn't even pause. "Scarro," he said, "because you never saw him coming. But when he left, you didn't forget the way the air changed." Then, almost under his breath, he added, "Still gives me chills." By the 2010s, Scarro's name had shifted from whispered threat to trivia answer. The streets had moved on. The mob itself had become pop culture, fodder for TV dramas, streaming documentaries, podcasts, neighborhood tours. Everyone had a theory, a hot take, a favorite theme song to go with their version of the story. But Scarro, he never fit into that Hollywood mold. There were no charming sit-down interviews, no courtroom smirks captured by grinning reporters, no snappy sound bites to loop over B-roll. He wasn't cinematic. He wasn't telegenic. And maybe that's why, in the end, his shadow lasted longer than his face. Nicodemo Scarfo was the kind of figure you couldn't wrap in nostalgia or soften with a good story. There was nothing warm about him, nothing that could make him into the kind of charming anti-hero people like to root for in movies. He was sharp in ways that cut through romanticized mob myths, and too ruthless for anyone to pretend otherwise. You didn't consume his story like entertainment, you studied it. You noticed it in the way a conversation changed when someone dropped their tone, or how a room held its breath for a second too long after someone muttered that in the old days you wouldn't have gotten away with that. That's what set him apart. Scarfo didn't have to leave behind an organization to keep his influence alive. He left something far more permanent, a sensation. It lasted longer than the casinos he skimmed from, longer than the trial footage, longer even than the men who once froze at the smallest tilt of his head. Oddly enough, the clearest insights into who Scarfo really was didn't come from agents or rivals, but from the people who lived through his reign and survived it. Not the ones who ended up in alleys or parking garages, but the ones still breathing, men who had worked for him, walked away from the life, and now kept low profiles in small towns, far from the streets that had once been their hunting grounds. One of them, years later, spoke under heavy anonymity. He'd served time, flipped, and now worked construction somewhere in the Midwest. The life? He didn't miss it. But Scarfo, well, that was different. He explained that being under Scarfo wasn't just about fear. It was about exhaustion. You didn't just watch what you said, you watched how you breathed. You woke up afraid and went to bed afraid until eventually you forgot what peace felt like. When asked if Scarfo had been a good boss, the man shook his head. He was the last boss you needed, not the first you wanted. That line stuck, because for all the paranoia and violence, Scarfo had done what few in the mob ever managed. He stamped his name on an entire decade of organized crime along the East Coast, from the early 1980s until his arrest in the middle of that decade. Scarfo's leadership wasn't about tradition or brotherhood. It was about precision and control. He didn't cherish the mob's code. He weaponized it. Silence wasn't just loyalty. It was leverage. It became the sword he wielded to keep men in line. Some say he was the one who sped up the mafia's decline, that he pushed it too far, too fast. Others think he was simply trying to survive a system that was already dying. Either way, while Scarfo tightened his grip on unions and casinos, law enforcement was getting smarter. Better wiretaps, more aggressive prosecutors, a witness protection program that actually worked. And Scarfo, in his obsession with order, gave them exactly what they needed, a pattern. His Achilles heel wasn't pride or greed, it was predictability. Once the FBI figured out his rhythms, who he trusted, how he reacted, how often he eliminated risk, they just waited for the cycle to repeat, and it always did. His rules were both his shield and his prison. He couldn't change them without betraying everything he believed in. By the end, he died behind bars, isolated, feared, and mostly misunderstood. The world had moved on. The neighborhoods he once controlled now had cameras on the corners and city inspectors instead of lookouts. But if you ever walked the streets of Atlantic City late at night, when the boardwalk was empty and the slot machines had gone quiet, you could almost feel something pressing in from the dark. A faint presence, as if someone was out there measuring you, deciding something only he knew. His grave was marked quietly. No crowd, no ceremony. But the structure of fear he'd built remained. You could still sense it in South Philly. Doors locking just a little quicker. Stories told with names left out. People glancing over their shoulders, not because Scarfo was coming, but because they remembered when he had. He hadn't created the Philadelphia mob, but he had changed its nature. The diplomacy that once existed was gone. In its place was a house with blood on every floorboard. The damage didn't show all at once. It was slow, like rot in the walls. By the early 90s, The family had splintered into factions, leadership bouncing between men no one feared quite the same way. No one could keep the pace Scarro had set. Some tried and failed. Others didn't live long enough to try again. Law enforcement, meanwhile, had adapted. They'd learned from him. The Scarro years had inspired new investigative policies, better protection for informants, sharper RICO prosecutions. Inside the FBI, his name became shorthand. Agents spoke of Scarro protocols when training rookies on how to dismantle organized crime families. He'd wanted to be untouchable. Instead, he became a manual for how to take down the untouchable. Still, beyond the official records and criminal charts, there was a cost no statistic could measure: the psychological toll. Men who'd worked under him carried the habits for life. Even years later, some in witness protection would wake in cold sweats. Some refused to answer the phone if it rang twice. Others checked their mirrors, even in grocery store parking lots. You didn't just work for Scarro. You learned to live inside his paranoia. One former driver, now in his 70s, remembered it over coffee in a small diner far from Philly. He didn't just make you scared, he made you careful. Every day, every call, you never forgot that one wrong move could be your last, even on your day off. When asked if he'd ever felt safe, the man laughed. Safe? Number with Nicky, you never felt safe. You felt compliant. That's the best you could hope for. And maybe that was the point. Scarro didn't want love, and he didn't even truly need loyalty. What he wanted was obedience, not the kind bought with bribes or enforced by threats, but the kind that sank into your bones until it shaped who you were. That was the real violence, the way he could make a man speak less, hope less, feel less. Historians of the mob still describe him differently from the others. Gotti was flashy, Luciano was strategic, Scarro was cold, calculated, the operator who left nothing to chance. Some even think he could have been successful in politics if he'd chosen another path. But in truth, he would have brought the same shadows with him, even into the brightest spotlight. Shadows were his currency. What he left unsaid was as important as anything he did. He once told an associate, "You don't win by being loud. You win by making them wonder what else you know." That line still gets repeated quietly by men who remember him, or by those who only pretend they do. And in the end, Scarro never needed a monument. His legacy wasn't in stone. It was in the silence he left behind. There were no speeches carved in stone for him, no poetic endings wrapped in ceremony. His influence did not echo in grand parades or linger in memorial services. His story lived in half-spoken sentences and in the weight of glances that told more than an hour of conversation could he led with silences that tightened the air in a room and made men unconsciously slow the way they folded a napkin or pause an extra second to check the lock before sleep. In a time when the underworld was full of loud jackets and louder egos, Scarro was the quietest man in the room. Somehow that quiet made him the most dangerous. That kind of presence doesn't leave like a shout, fading down the block. It seeps away slowly like steam, escaping a hidden crack in an alley pipe, the kind you don't notice until you realize you should not be there at all. Years after his time, both sides of the law still spoke about what they called the Scarfo standard: prosecutors, defense attorneys, FBI agents. They did not use his name because he was the most profitable or the most ruthless. Others made more money. Others left longer trails of bodies, but he had turned fear itself into a structured system, a daily practice that shaped how others behaved. There was no annual pilgrimage to his grave. No black cars idling at the gates, no quiet men in dark suits tipping their hats at the cemetery fence. His memory lived in places where people talked in half-formed phrases, spoken low and reluctantly in the corners of diners or in union offices with fading paint. They spoke his name slowly, as if they were swallowing it like a bitter pill, not because they feared him in the present, but because they could still recall the chill of fearing him in the past. What set him apart was not raw muscle or overflowing wealth. It was that in many ways he seemed smaller than the empire he commanded. He should not have been the man on top. And yet there he stood, directing men twice his size, twice as loud, and 3 times as reckless. He moved with precise timing, knowing exactly when to act and when to remain still. Sometimes doing nothing was his deadliest decision. That is the hardest part to explain to anyone who did not live in his shadow. The fear did not come from the weapon in his hand. It came from the pause that came before it. That slight tilt of his head, the silence that followed, it was in that pause. Your stomach would sink because you realized he no longer needed to speak to seal your fate. Some say he could have died a free man if he had stepped away early enough, if he had handed off control and let others take the heat. But that was not in him. He was not built for peace. Control was the air he breathed. Even as the years chipped away at his influence, he held tighter, refusing to let go. In one old recording, taken years after his peak, but before the end, he told an associate, "The only way to know they will not betray you is to erase the idea they ever could." It was clean cold and final, a perfect distillation of his mind. There was no opera in that fall, no tragic heroism, just a man who had outlived his usefulness and carried a grudge against the world for daring to move on without him. He was not remembered warmly, but he was remembered firmly. His name pressed into conversations, not floated, and still in certain corners his methods lived on. Criminal networks continued to borrow from his habits, not because they wanted to be him, but because they could not forget him. In the years after his rule, the city's criminal landscape shifted. New faces rose, new alliances formed. The loud suits and headline, chasing antics faded, replaced by quieter moves and smaller footprints. This was not homage, it was recovery. The city itself had to learn how to breathe differently after him. Some younger men tried to revive his style. They studied his life like a blueprint. They practiced his stillness, his suspicion, his iron control. But imitation has limits. They could never recreate the time that shaped him. His rise came when Atlantic City was new again, when unions were ripe for takeover, when technology lagged behind ambition. His fall came when technology caught up. Wiretaps, RICO laws, soldiers turning informant. The digital age he began eroding the walls he built. If he taught the underworld anything, it was that total control is a myth. He lived as if loyalty could be calculated like numbers on a page, as if risk could be erased like debt in a ledger. But people are not numbers. They break under pressure. They make mistakes. They choose themselves over the code. And that was the crack he never accounted for. His empire collapsed from the inside, but the lessons he left behind still travel. Modern crime families still meet in loud restaurants to cover their words. They still rotate phones. They still build layers between the boss and the business. None of these ideas were new, but he polished them into second nature. A playbook not meant to be followed step for step, but impossible to ignore. One retired FBI agent keeps Scarro's photograph on a corkboard in his home. Not as tribute, but as a reminder. He once said, "That man showed us how deep silence can cut." When someone stops talking, that is when you lean in the closest. Scarro taught people to listen with more fear than they listened to threats. Even now, his name surfaces in law enforcement training, not simply as a criminal, but as an engineer of unease. Violence can be explained. Dread cannot. It is simply felt. Scarro understood that better than most. His greatest weapon was not a gun or a crew. It was his ability to make ordinary moments feel like the edge of danger. Some call that leadership. Others call it illness. Somewhere in the middle lies the truth. By the end, the line between the man and the myth was gone. He was no longer remembered for what he built, but for what others refused to rebuild after him. Even in prison, he kept his structure, letters written with precision, routines enforced, shaving at the same time, eating at the same time, requesting the same commissary items. Not because it comforted him, but because it kept him in control. Control was the last thing he owned, and when age took that away, when his hands trembled and his eyes dimmed, he did not change. He simply retreated into the quiet, into routine, into the space where legends live. Over time, his name has shifted from something recalled in detail to something invoked like a warning. His generation faded as the digital era transformed the underworld into something new: crimes carried out behind VPNs and encrypted messages, profits stored in crypto wallets instead of cash stacks in a back room. The kind of menace Scarrow mastered belonged to an analog age when a single look could be an order and a single pause could be a death sentence. Back in those days, messages didn't travel through emails or phones. They moved through eye contact, the flick of an ashtray, or the weight of an envelope passed quietly from one hand to another. Most of those envelopes are long gone, but the memory of what they once carried still lingers in certain corners of Philadelphia. In the old Union halls with ceilings stained by decades of cigarette smoke, his name isn't shouted, it isn't even whispered. It just hangs there, like dust no one wants to disturb. For all his caution, all his obsessive need to control the pieces on the board, Scarrow never controlled the final telling of his own story. Once the indictments hit, once witnesses started talking, and the cameras rolled into courtrooms, the narrative slipped from his hands. The FBI shaped it. The newspapers reshaped it. Years later, historians and TV producers took their turn. The man who once ruled with precision was reduced to sound bites. Little Don with a bloody legacy. The butcher of Atlantic City. A whisper in a silk suit. That last one would have made him furious. Too soft, too poetic. Scarrow didn't want to be romanticized. He wanted to be unmistakable, clear, director. But clarity never saved him. There's a detail from his prison years that stuck with people. In the early 2000s, he kept an old typewriter in his cell, not to write memoirs. He wasn't the confessional kind. He didn't trust touchscreens, didn't trust anything he couldn't hear click. Every sentence he typed was short, sharp, deliberate, like a man counting bullets. Most of those pages didn't survive. He'd tear them up as soon as they were done. He didn't believe in drafts. To him, you either said it right the first time, or you didn't say it at all. One guard said, "He wrote like he talked," and when he stopped, you felt like you'd messed up somehow. That control, down to the punctuation, was part of what kept him alive longer than most men in his world. But it also kept him alone. Men obeyed Scarrow, but few actually liked him, and even fewer loved him. He didn't allow it. Affection was a risk. Warmth was a weakness. And so by the end, the only people who remembered him fondly were the ones who never truly knew him. That's the cruel math of men like Scarrow. You spend your whole life mastering fear, and you're remembered most warmly by strangers. Yet the structure he helped build didn't vanish. The systems of silence, the code words, the layered hierarchies, the disposable intermediaries, those still survive. His paranoia was ahead of its time. Today's criminals might use encrypted messages instead of envelopes, but many still live by Scarrow's rules. Keep exposure low, break the chain of trust, and never believe the second handshake more than the first. Some still call him the last real boss Philadelphia ever had. The final ruler who never smiled for the cameras, never spoke out of turn, never left a room until he knew the message had landed exactly how he wanted it. The final ruler who never smiled for the cameras, never spoke out of turn, never left a room until he knew the message had landed exactly how he wanted it. So what's legacy? Is it about results you can point to? Or is it about fear that never quite leaves the air? Scarrow left no monuments, no mansions, no dynasty carrying his name. His empire wasn't built on stone or neon signs. It was built in hesitation, in the gap between action and reaction. That's why, even now, when old associates talk about him, they don't speak of him like a king. They speak of him like a force of nature, someone you didn't work for so much as work around. His approval felt like relief. His silence felt like danger. Even in mafia history books, his chapter doesn't read like a simple rise and fall. It reads more like a storm map, pressure building, a sudden break, the wreckage afterward. He didn't create a family. He extracted obedience from one. And that difference is what makes his shadow so heavy, even decades later. When the blood dried and the courtrooms emptied, something strange happened. his name started showing up in places he would have despised: college lectures, crime podcasts, online top 10 lists. In these retellings, the edges were smoothed out. The suffocating silences, the ruined lives, the constant dread, gone. All that remained was a cartoon of a small man with a short fuse, a boss with a couple of flashy suits, a tyrant who made Philadelphia hold its breath for nearly 10 years. Even diluted, the name drew people in, because Scarro resisted easy packaging. He wasn't showy like Gotti. He didn't go out in flames like Castellano. He didn't disappear like Hoffa. He simply sat in his cell, year after year, cooling into something unmovable. Steel doesn't rust in the dark. It just waits. For the few who truly knew him, memories of Scarro are still handled like explosives. A retired union rep once said, "You didn't talk to Nicky. You passed messages." Direct conversation meant he'd remember your voice, and you didn't want that. It wasn't fear in the normal sense. It was self-preservation. Scarro was a boss who didn't need loyalty pledges or public shows of respect. He wanted reflexes. He wanted you trained to understand that even a small misstep would cost you something. That's why his story never became folklore. Folklore needs heroes, and Scarro didn't deal in heroics. He dealt in calculation, and the damage he left wasn't just in the bodies or the headlines. It was in the lingering paranoia. Even years later, in retirement homes, far from South Philly, men who once sat across from him still check the blinds twice before bed, not because they think he's coming back, but because he once might have. He'd rewired their instincts. That's power that lasts beyond a position. That's legacy without permission. Some people still call his story a failure. His empire crumbled, his family fractured, his bloodline carried the stain, but others see it differently. What if collapse was part of the plan? What if the goal was never to last, but to leave a scar? Men like Scarro don't build monuments. They build hesitation. They build that moment of stillness before someone answers you. That sense that the wrong word might end something you didn't even know was on the line. Decades after his last phone call, his last order, his last stare, that silence still sits in the air. There's an old story from Atlantic City, back when one of its casinos was still standing. A janitor claimed he walked past a back room and found Scarro sitting alone, staring at a map of the city. No one else in sight, no words. Just him, his finger resting on Pacific Avenue. The janitor, nervous, asked if he needed anything. Scarro looked up and said no. I already know where everything ends. The remains of his life now mostly exist in red folders, locked away in government archives. Evidence logs, wiretap transcripts, surveillance reports typed on yellowing paper. His grave is in a place few visit, but his name still shows up in conferences, in crime books, in late-night TV interviews with men who once swore they'd never talk. What none of those records capture is the atmosphere, the way conversations shifted when his name came up, how even the hardest men would lower their voices, not out of superstition, but because Scarro had the rare talent of lingering. His fear had a half-life. There are men alive today who haven't seen him in 40 years, but still hesitate before telling a story that includes him. Not because they think he'll walk through the door, but because somewhere deep down, they believe he'd already know what they said. That's not just crime, that's architecture. Scarro didn't build a family or a future. He built a feeling. And in the end, the worst wound came not from an enemy, but from his own blood. His nephew, who testified against him. It stripped the legend bare, turned him into ledger entries and cafeteria conversations. For Scarro, that betrayal was proof that every ounce of his paranoia had been justified. When Nicodemos Scarro finally slipped out of the world he'd once commanded, it wasn't in a blaze of headlines or a courtroom packed with enemies. He'd spent his life ensuring no one was safe from him, and in the end, that included himself. Prison wasn't supposed to be his curtain call. Men like Scarro saw their twilight years at corner tables in dimly lit restaurants, nursing coffee, trading nods that meant more than words. They pictured influence, passed along in gestures, not under fluorescent prison lights, but his last years were stripped of elegance. The body failed him first. The voice that had once tightened every spine in a room grew small. Eyes that once sized up a man's worth before he spoke now strained over prescription bottles. He'd outlived nearly everyone who'd once been loyal. The power was gone, but the silence remained. A nurse who worked at FMC Butner, where Scarrow spent his final year, remembered how he would sit with a towel folded across his lap, hands locked together, staring not at the TV, not at the other inmates, but at a blank wall. One day she asked if he wanted her to change the channel. He shook his head once and said, "The noise doesn't change anything." Even at the end, he clung to control. The order that had once dictated the movements of a city now narrowed to the way a breakfast tray was arranged or how a napkin was folded. He was still running the world, only now that world fit inside a single room. That's what made Scarrow different from most mob bosses. He didn't just crave power, he feared its absence. Every deal, every call, every death had been about holding on to the story he told about himself. When the telling was taken from him, by the feds, by Leonetti, by the press, it was a deeper wound than prison bars. He didn't get to write the ending. And for a man like him, that was the true defeat. Now his name is told by strangers who never sat across from him, who never felt the weight of his eyes. But in certain corners of South Philly, a man might still pause, outside a shuttered restaurant, and remember. In Atlantic City, a dealer might recall slipping an envelope into the wrong hand and hearing nothing, not a threat, not a warning, just silence, and for weeks after, wondering. In the end, what remains of Scarrow isn't a statue or a museum plaque. It's an atmosphere, a climate people still feel without needing to name it. He wasn't the storm itself. He was the drop in pressure before it hit. His mark doesn't show up in neon signs or casino memorabilia. You find it in places where doors stayed locked in daylight, in family habits passed down without explanation, in conversations that stop before certain names are said. Even after his name faded from headlines, the ripple stayed. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, like static on a phone line, like the sense that someone else is holding the last page of your story. His life is still used in training rooms across the country, not just to explain organized crime, but to teach how fear is built, how it moves, and how it eats itself. One instructor put it best. Scarrow didn't run a family. He ran a philosophy. No one was safe, not even him. The loyalty he demanded so sharply eventually became brittle. The systems he designed to keep betrayal out only bred more of it. The silence he had mastered became a kind of isolation that even he couldn't escape. He could win every battle and still lose the war because he didn't know how to stop fighting, even after the war was his. Some thought he longed for peace. Those who knew him said peace would have bored him. A corrections officer remembered Scarrow's final months. He didn't watch TV, rarely spoke, and asked for only one thing: put the fan on. Low, but on. It wasn't about comfort. It was about sound. Maybe it drowned the quiet. Maybe it reminded him of the world he once ruled, a world that never stopped buzzing, and so his story closed without fireworks. No last confession, no dramatic send-off. Just the quiet click of a cell door, the low hum of an old fan, and a file tucked into an archive no one visits. His legacy wasn't built to be loud. It was made of still air, of moments people still hesitate to mention, of footsteps counted in empty halls. If you've ever sat alone at night and felt the space around you shift without a sound, you've brushed against the kind of presence Scarrow left behind. It's not the men who shout that stay with you. It's the ones who never needed to. So, with his story now told, let the edges fade. Let the names, long ones, whispered ones, drift back into the silence they came from. We've walked through decades tonight, through alleys not marked on any map, through conversations cut short, through lives shaped by glances, and the weight of not knowing what came next. You can stop walking now. Let the boardwalk fade. Let the last street lamp blink out in the distance. You don't need to watch the windows anymore. You don't have to keep your back to the wall. There's nothing waiting in the shadows now. What's left is stillness. Just the hum of the fan. just your own breath easing into the quiet. Stories like this aren't meant to stir you up. They're meant to settle you down. To hush the day, so close your eyes. Let the memories, yours or not, pass by without grabbing them. Let the ghost walk away. Let the city rest. Let the silence mean peace this time, not fear. You've heard enough for one night.